Chapter 17, Origins of Life. So here we're going to talk about the scientific hypotheses on how life arose. And we start with the well-known Miller-Urey experiments, in which Stanley Miller, and this was back in the 50s when he was a graduate student, his academic advisor Urey, devised an experiment in which they took what were presumed to be the basic compounds that were present in the Earth's early atmosphere, that is some methane, ammonia, hydrogen gas, and water vapor. And again, in the gaseous state, they basically provided energy to this mixture in the form of an electric shock, if you will, and so they provided an electric shock to energize the system, and they wanted to see what would happen, so they recondensed this gas by cooling it down and collected the liquid. And what they found was that from these simple, what you would call inorganic molecules, they were able to generate, or inorganic I should say, they were able to generate small organic molecules, basically some simple amino acids. And this is interesting and important because when you have things like amino acids, you can build, of course, proteins, and these are some of the basic building blocks of living things. They demonstrated that, again, you could take these simple things and build more complex things. Now, one key here is that what you don't see in their mixture is free oxygen. The early Earth was considered to be an anaerobic place, or anoxic, free of oxygen, and also, therefore, it had a reducing atmosphere. There was no oxygen there to oxidize things. And that's a key because when you have oxygen present, it will often break down complex molecules that form and basically prevent that from happening. So, now, where did this happen? This process, where would it happen? It could have happened at the surface. You would have had to have water present, but it could be at the surface, in relatively shallow waters. It could be deeper down. It's thought that maybe at these hydrothermal vents deep in the ocean where you have cracks in the earth crust and lots of hot water coming out of the floor of the sea, out of the seafloor, carrying lots of nutrients with them, that perhaps it may have happened there. It's also hypothesized that maybe some of these building blocks for life came from outer space, even on meteorites perhaps. So when you start building these simple building blocks of life, they can begin to assemble into cell-like structures, or a protocell. And so this is sort of the way it's thought to maybe have happened. Again, you had an early inorganic world to a large extent. You had the abiotic synthesis, the synthesis of small organic molecules under non-living conditions. You began to get the formation of even larger molecules, and you would have to have the formation of some kind of lipids that you could use to build up membranes. So once you have these membrane-like structures and these other molecules, certain proteins, and also some kind of hereditary material, presumably RNA came first, these things begin to assemble into these protocells. And inside these cells, you have sort of a unique chemistry, or a simple type of metabolism, and some of that hereditary material, and these things start to exhibit the characteristics of life. They essentially have a cell-like structure, they have a metabolism, and with that RNA in particular, RNA can make copies of itself. The cell can then begin to divide, so you have sort of a simple type of reproduction present. So, in this oxygen-free world, you can get the building up of these molecules and the formation of cell-like structures. Alright, so that's presumably, or at least the scientific explanation of how the first living things came about. Well, how do we learn about early life, or life period? We can look at fossils, because fossils give us good clues about what was here at one time. These sedimentary rocks, the sediment that flows down rivers and streams into lakes and ponds in the ocean deposits sediment. It builds up over time, gets compressed into rock, and when things get buried in it, organisms get buried in it, they can fossilize, and you can see basically the outlines of the bones or the outlines of shells, imprints of feet like a dinosaur, and even some types of fossils where the organism is sort of embedded in a material like amber and preserved in time, through time. And so, if we look at the Earth's history as sort of like a clock, where at the beginning of time, of course, you get the formation of the Earth. That's about 4.6 billion years ago. And then, of course, the Earth is this sort of molten mass at that time. It's extremely hot, begins to cool down, and then you get the formation of the first solid material, the first rocks. And then we start to see, somewhere around, more or less 3.8 billion years ago, the first evidence of fossils, simple cell structure, simple prokaryotes. Now, a little later, we get the development of photosynthesis. We start to see the first evidence in rocks of oxidation occurring, the presence of oxygen, which photosynthesis, you would need that to produce that oxygen. The oxygen begins to build up, and much later we now start to get a relatively oxygen-rich atmosphere up to the about 21% level that we see now in our atmosphere. First eukaryotes, around 1.5 billion years ago. Then the first multicellular animals, multicellular organisms. Then we get the developments of animals, and then plants, dinosaurs, and then finally people much more recently. We'll talk about this more now. With these fossils, how do we figure out how old rocks are and how old the fossils are inside them? Well, we use what's called radioisotope dating, in which we look at isotopes. You remember isotopes are forms of forms of elements that have various numbers of neutrons. And so, for example, with carbon-12, that's the basic carbon that has 6 neutrons. But then you can have carbon-13 and carbon-14, which have 7 and 8 neutrons. And so these are the various isotopes of carbon. And C14 in particular is a radioactive isotope of carbon, which means it breaks down and we'll lose some of those neutrons. And so when the breakdown of this C14 and other radioactive isotopes occurs at a constant rate. And we refer to that rate as the half-life. So for example, carbon-14 breaks down into nitrogen, and so this occurs over a period of about 5,730 years. So in a sample of some organic material that has carbon in it, you'll have a certain amount of carbon-14. Well, after 5,730 years, you will only have half of the original amount left. Okay? And so that's basically the first half-life. The second half-life, you'll have half of this amount, or 1/4 of the original left. And that's after approximately 11,000 some odd years, 400 years more or less. And then after the third half-life, you'll have half of this previous amount, or 1/8 of the original amount. And you can do this with other types of isotopes you see here. And so what happens is you can use these to date things, and that's how many of these dates that we're going to be used here, that's how they're arrived at. Because there are some of the original rocks that formed early on in Earth left, and we can age them and see again that the Earth is about 4.6. The first fossil is about 3.5. Photosynthesis 3.4. Eukaryotes 2.2. The first, which essentially, and then the formation of the first protistans at this time as well. And the first animals about 600 million years ago, and you can see some fossils of the first animals here. And so, just go through time here a little bit. So, this is what's known as the Precambrian, this early stage in Earth's history where we have, of course, the formation of the Earth, the first living things, and the evolution of these simple living things. But when we get animals, we start to enter what's known as the Paleozoic, in particular the early Paleozoic known as the Cambrian, when we had the Cambrian explosion, when many types of new animals evolved in a fairly quick time period. That is quick in terms of the geologic record. Now this was all in the water at first, but eventually things began to invade land, and what made that possible was all that oxygen that was accumulating in the atmosphere. When you have oxygen in the atmosphere, particularly higher in the atmosphere, and it's interacting with sunlight, those oxygen molecules can break in two, forming these very unstable individual oxygen molecules. Well, they tend to react with with O2, forming O3, which is ozone. And you had the formation of the ozone layer, which, as you probably know, is this protective layer that blocks out ultraviolet light. And therefore, organisms are able to leave the water and start to inhabit land, because now they no longer have to worry about all that ultraviolet light. And so plants do this, animals begin to do this. We start to get the development of amphibians from fish, and then reptiles from amphibians. We enter the Mesozoic, which is the age of reptiles, dinosaurs essentially. We also have mammals then, but they're not terribly prominent organisms. Again, this is the age of reptiles. We start to see the first flowering plants. The Therapsid, which is thought to be a reptile that essentially gave rise to some of the first mammals. And so you can see this is a relatively lengthy period of time, from about 250 to 65 million years ago. About 65 million years ago, as far as we can tell, the dinosaurs went extinct. Well, they definitely went extinct, and it was about that time. Then we enter the Cenozoic, the current geologic era that we're in, the age of mammals. Mammals, considerable diversification, lots of large mammals evolving. Here's the giant ground sloth. You can see this is a good-sized creature. It's extinct now, but it used to roam these parts a long time ago. And there was a time when there was a lot of large flightless birds, including number 5 here, these terror birds that lived in South America. You can see how big they are relative to people. Some of these were carnivorous, and so you can imagine they wouldn't want to run into one of those guys. But of course, there was no people back then, because this is about 2 million years ago. Alright, more recently, the latter stages of the Cenozoic, we enter what's called the Pleistocene, and this is the period in Earth's history when there's a lot of changes in the climate. We go through glacial periods where there's ice ages, and then interglacial periods where it's relatively warm. We're currently in an interglacial period where the Earth's climate is relatively warm. But there were periods, about 18,000 years ago was the peak of the last ice age, where good chunks of the northern hemisphere were covered in ice. Woolly mammoths, people back then living in these cold climates. And so you can see for the last 200,000 years, that's about how long people have been around, what we would refer to as sort of anatomically correct or modern humans, as opposed to our ancestors, bringing us to the current time when We exist, but a lot of these other things have gone extinct.